as you know, everything I tell you is a lie, right? Is that a true statement? I don't know. I was just joking about test because the word test is such a highly charged word. And it's a way to get students to pay attention suddenly. But the real focus of this lecture is the opposite of testing. It's things like curiosity, searching for truth, trying to understand something new. And the lecture that I want to give you today is from my own journey. It's about my own search for truth. It's about fulfilling my own curiosity. So the lecture that I'm going to give you today is meant to be a kind of model of what Maitland was talking about, of trying to question some of the most obvious beliefs. And I think those of you in stream 2, maybe you didn't read Morgan yet, but the next article that you read, Yale Freshman by Morgan, is going to emphasize curiosity, search for truth, communication. So my lecture is anticipating a reading that you will soon read. Now, last week you had a talk by Magic Mike. I'm afraid I have no magic for you. But at least I can tell you a story. Do you want to hear a story? Okay, let me begin this lecture with no magic trick, but just a story. Okay? Once upon a time. All right? All true stories begin with that, once upon a time, right? So, once upon a time, there was a young American writer. And this young American writer was really interested in Japan. And so he bought a one-way ticket and he went to Kyoto. And he had been a university teacher in America, and all his life he wanted to wander. And he had read Roshi and Soshi and Basho and Issa. And in Kyoto, he studied Shiatsu. And he did Zazen. And he lived in a room in a dirty, small, old apartment near Kyoto Station, halfway between Higashi Honganji Temple and Nishi Honganji Temple. His room had no shower and no bathtub. So whenever he wanted to get clean, he had to go to the sento. And it didn't have any heat in the winter. And he didn't have so much money. So he stayed warm by eating udon and nishin soba. Then, through a connection, he got a job at Ritsumeikan University in the Bungakubu department. And soon after that, at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. And he was really happy to return to the university, to be back in the university after living in a small apartment and after having a hard life. So, what is this story about? Yeah, this is my story. This is my story before you were born. Right? Before you were born. All right. And when this young writer got back into the university, there were university buildings, there were libraries, there were students in blue jeans, and they were drinking Coca-Cola, and once more, he felt like he was home. It's not my son, okay? It's not my son. But gradually, that's not me either, okay? But gradually, things began to get really strange, all right? Things began to get really strange. he found out that his students had 14 or 15 classes every week. Okay, go out that way. Had 14 or 15 classes every week, not 3 or 4 classes. And he found that he was teaching language classes, but the language classes only met 1 time a week. But everybody knows you can't learn a language by having a class once a week. Right? It's impossible. And sometimes he asked his students would come to him and say, "Sensei, I'm sorry I can't go to class next week." And I would say, "Why?" He would say, "Why?" And they would say, I have a club activity. I have a club activity, so I will miss class." And he might ask them, "Well, why did you come to university?" And some of them said, "Asobi." So he got really frustrated, and he wondered, why don't the students study? Why would they miss classes for club activities? And why would there be more classes every week for something like studying a language like English or Spanish? All right. And he gradually realized from his confusion that he was making a mistake. Right? And this is the main hypothesis of my lecture today, the mistake that I was making. And the mistake was this, that I was teaching in a university in Japan, and because the form was the same as the American universities that I had attended and that I had taught at, because the form was the same, I thought the function was the same. I thought the function was the same. So my lecture today is my attempt to think my way through this problem. How over the years I tried to account for this confusion and for this disjunction. Now, first I want to make a couple points, all right, just so you understand the title. Form versus function in higher education. ICU as a hybrid university. Right? I think, do you know the meaning of hybrid? Right? Hybrid means a combination. I think in Japanese, zashu kongo. A combination. And so my lecture today is going to be about Japanese universities and American universities, and it's going to end with ICU. And maybe it will give you some insight, some new insight into ICU. So now my lecture starts. Are you ready?
Yes.
No more stories. But that's a true story, actually, and you can ask me about it sometime. Those early years in Kyoto were really, really interesting for me. All right. So, as you know from my handout, I'm going to first talk about similarities between US and Japanese universities, and then I'm going to move on to some of the differences. And then, to understand more deeply these similarities and differences, I'm going to take a look at high schools in both countries and some of the social and cultural assumptions that underlie them. And then I'm going to come back to ICU. All right. So, first of all, what are some of the similarities between Japanese and American universities? And by the way, who was ICU founded by? Do you know? Okay, really important to kind of know something about the founding of your university. It's not an imperial university, right? Like Tokyo University. And it's not really a company university. Right? So it was a liberal arts college founded after the war, founded after World War II. I think it first began actually as a language institute for 1 or 2 years, and then it became a 4-year university. But it was founded by both Japanese and American scholars. So it was founded together by scholars from 2 countries. And that's a kind of interesting background, as well as that time in history. All right, so let's forget about ICU for now, okay? And we'll come back to it in a minute. So the first and most obvious similarities is it prepares students for white-collar careers in business, government, law, and medicine. I'm now wearing white-collar today, but I'm a white-collar worker, right? A new name for a white-collar worker, a more sophisticated name, is a knowledge worker. Right? Most of you didn't come to ICU to be daikusan. And you didn't come to maybe run an udon or soba shop, like the kind that kept me warm and fed in Kyoto during those cold winters. Instead, you came to ICU to prepare for a white-collar career. Right? You are lucky. You are already wearing white collar. So maybe you don't have to study hard at ICU. It's already there. All right, so that's the first point. Now, I don't want to make this lecture too easy for you, so you have to fill in the gaps, okay? All right. The second commonality is to provide information, research, and opinion to the government and also to private industry. So in a way, universities in both Japan and the United States, a second role that they play is to provide analysis and research to government bodies, to government ministries like the Ministry of Education or Ministry of Trade and Commerce, but also to private companies. Right? Many professors have more than one hat. If you go to Hitotsubashi, for example, many of the professors also advise Toyota, or they advise Sony, or they have a dual role. They hold special workshops, seminars. And private industry in Japan, as well as government, relies upon the work of university professors and institutes. Okay? So there's an interesting word for this. I already taught you knowledge workers. Universities function in some ways as, quote, think tanks. All right? Think tanks are places where people think and analyze and produce data. All right. C, the next similarity. It's quite interesting that even though universities in Japan, in general, are much younger than the United States, Japan is much, much older, right? The US is like a teenager, right, compared to Japan, all right? But Yale University, Harvard University, the University of Virginia, University of Pennsylvania, these universities are very old. They were founded right around the time of American independence. And the Japanese universities were really founded right during the Meiji era, just before the turn of the century. So they are much younger, but their purpose was really the same, and that is to train an elite. After those universities were founded, only about 1 to 5% of the population attended them. It was really a very specialized group. And that group that attended Osaka University, Kobe University, University of Tokyo, or Harvard, Yale, Penn, Virginia, they went on, they were trained to become the leaders in government, the leaders in industry, and also, in the case of the United States, leaders in religion. The early American universities were affiliated with different Christian groups, and then they evolved after that. But that's one similarity. So the distant origins, C, are quite similar. Now, D, to me, is really kind of an important one because it's part of the story that I told you. The appearance and the organization of universities in both countries is remarkably the same. It's remarkably the same. They appear to be almost identical. So in Japan, to get a degree, a BA or a bachelor's degree, you study 4 years, usually. Same thing in the US, in North America. You study a major, right? You graduate with a major in a subject. Same thing, US and America. You have to take required courses. You sit in desks like this. You listen to PowerPoint lectures like this. Maybe professors don't tell you personal stories as much, okay? But in general, it's remarkably the same. You have advisors. You register for courses. You have GPAs. Even the professors have the same ranks, like Kyoju, Jo Kyoju, and so on. So remarkably similar, the buildings, the libraries, the cafeterias. Okay. So the appearance and the organization are very similar, and that's why I was so confused during my early years at Ritsumeikan Daigaku. Now, there are also some important differences. Okay? Important differences. And I think these are really interesting. All right? Differences between US and Japanese universities. Now, do you remember many years ago you read a book called College Thinking by Jack Mayland? I hope just a few days ago, right? And Mayland has key concepts, 2 key concepts. Descriptive statements and normative statements. If you don't know the difference, you should read it carefully and find out the difference. Those are some of the only words that are italicized in italic. Now, what I'm going to talk about right now in this lecture are normative differences. I am exaggerating a little bit. I am kind of using a stereotype in order to look at more clearly some distinctions between the two. All right. So first, differences between US and Japanese universities. In the US, most universities, maybe not Harvard and Stanford, but most universities are easy to enter. All right? Students don't go to Juku for 3 or 4 years. All right? They don't study really hard. Oh, I've got to pass the entrance exam. Okay. In general, they are easy to enter, but they are hard to graduate from. They are not easy to graduate from. I'll give you some statistics in a minute to give you some evidence of that. By contrast, especially the better universities in Japan are hard to enter, but easy to graduate from. Okay? Maybe not ICU. In general, this is a normative statement. All right. So let me give you some statistics. In Japan, you don't have to write this down, okay? But listen because they're kind of interesting. In Japan, about 55% of all high school graduates either enter university or Senbongakko, technical college. All right? 90% graduate on time. 90%. It's incredible. How do they do that? How do they do that? Well, one theory is the escalator. Okay? Some sociologists say if you get into Todai or ICU or Waseda, and at least you come and sit in class and you take some tests, it's like being on the first step of the escalator. Boo. You don't have to do a lot. You don't have to walk, but it will take you to the top. So in Japan, there is largely an escalator system in the universities. Okay? So if you do the minimum, you will graduate, don't worry. Okay? All right. In the US, there's no escalator. All right? There's no escalator. For example, in the US, about the same number enter university. Well, actually a little bit more, about 65% of the population at some point enters technical school or university, but only 35% finish. Only 35% finish, all right? Now, what's even more remarkable, of those 35% that finish, half don't finish in 6 years. Okay? Within 6 years, they don't finish. It kind of goes on and on. So there are really, I think, some remarkable differences. Isn't it interesting? All right. So I think that my statement, my assertion that Japanese universities are hard to enter but easy to graduate from is kind of supported. And my statement that in the US, they are easier to enter, they are easier to enter but harder to graduate from, also appears to be true. All right. Now let's go on to another difference, some other differences. B. In the US, there's great freedom of movement. Great freedom of movement. Now, within the university, you can change departments, you can change divisions. I want to tell you a story about my younger brother, John, or Johnny, as we used to call him. So, Johnny went to the University of Wisconsin. Okay? And Johnny changed his major 23 times. So, I would call up John, and I would say, "Hey, Johnny, what is your major this week?" So, very easy to change your major. And it's also relatively easy to change universities. Okay? Very easy to change universities. And you get credit. All right? So you don't have to start over. In fact, many university systems in America are set up for almost automatic transfer. You go to community college for 2 years, and then you can go to UCLA or the University of California, Berkeley, or the University of Michigan. Okay? Top universities, all right? Really good universities. So and you can also transfer between private schools and public schools and private schools, and so on. So tremendous freedom of movement. Okay. Now, in Japan, for most universities, there is no change permitted. Okay. Now, first of all, for example, at Ritsumeikan, when students entered Ritsumeikan, they had to choose their major. They would be in business or accounting or law. They didn't have an opportunity. They couldn't be like my brother Johnny, right? Okay. Now, ICU is an exception, all right? We'll come to that later. But in general, at most universities, there's no freedom of movement within the university. Also, there is almost no freedom of movement between universities. If you want to go to another university and you're a junior, you have to start over. You receive no credit for your courses. But that's not true in the United States. So it's quite a different system. By the way, I know that's probably one of the reasons why many of you came to ICU. High school students have no idea what psychology really is or what economics really is. In fact, even after you take a few foundation courses, it's really difficult to understand those subjects because you're just being introduced. So how do you know how to major in them in advance? So you might not know it, but this system is relatively new at ICU. It's just 3 or 4 years old. So I think you are really lucky. All right, C. Oh, yep, C, all right? Now, this is a related point to freedom of movement. In the US, there are no ronin, right? There are almost no ronin. And that's because you can change schools and you can get credit for it. So there's no real reason to not go to university. In fact, if you don't get into your dream school, it's better to go to another university and show that you are a good student and show that you can succeed and get top grades, and then transfer to the dream school that you wanted to go to. So the complete lack of ronin in America is a really kind of interesting difference. Of course, in Japan, we all know students who not only were ronin for 1 year, but some maybe who were 2 years ronin. And I even know some cases where they were ronin for 3 years. Right? So it's a very different system. All right, let's go on to D. Many electives, all right? Many electives at US universities, few at Japanese universities. When I taught at Ritsumeikan, for example, during the first 2 years of study, the students had almost no choice of classes. Almost all of their classes were decided. Finally, when they became juniors, samensei, they began to have some choice. Okay. Now I know you are suffering through ELA, all right? Okay. And you do have some GE requirements, but compared to the, quote, typical Japanese university student, right, you have a lot more freedom. But really, at most Japanese universities, it is kind of like Malin says, it's unlike Malin says, it's a kind of extension of high school in terms of the curriculum. Very little freedom of choice. Okay. At my university, it's really interesting. There were only, when I entered the university, there were only 2 required courses. And they were not actually required courses, okay? If you were a humanities student, you had to take 1 science class. And if you were a science major, you had to take at least 1 humanities class. That was it. No other requirements. Huh? That's how I graduated. Actually, now that's unusual, okay? That's a kind of exaggeration. Not all schools have such few requirements. But in general, that's a really big difference. All right. Now, E. Another difference is this. Typically in North America, Canada, and the US, university students like you only take maybe 4 courses a term. You only take 4 courses. My students at Ritsumeikan had 14, sometimes 15, if they were going to major, if they were going to get a teaching certificate. So at most Japanese universities, as you know, classes meet only once a week. You have 1 90-minute class a week. So you have many classes every term. I was so impressed with my students, how they could keep all of their notebooks in order, because they had so many different courses, so many different notebooks, so many different teachers, that I thought it would be really hard for them. All right, F. Are you following me? Are you taking good notes? There's a test coming afterwards. All right. I tried to motivate you, right? So F. In North America in general, and in the US in particular, there's an incredibly wide variety of university students. Okay? For example, when I used to teach university in the United States, if I had a class of, say, 20 or 25 students, say a writing class, there would be men who were 65 years old. There would be single mothers. There might even be some high school students. there was an incredible diversity of students. If it was a night class, there would be some businessmen or businesswomen in the class. So the students in front of me were incredibly diverse. Now, of course, in your hearts and personalities, you are diverse. But if I take the 20 students right here, probably you are almost all the same age. You have a very similar background. So there is a much greater uniformity in Japan in the universities. So I think that's also a very important difference. You are mainly in the same stage of life. Okay. Now, I want to do a little aside here. One thing that's really pretty cool about ICU is the adult student program. That we do have some kind of shakaijin and adult students who come back and enter the university. And if you have one of them in your class, you should really value them. You should ask for their opinion and draw on their life experience because they are really special people. You're lucky to have them. All right. G. What is G, do you think? All right. Well, okay, all right. G. Classes are, in the US, classes are two-way. They're supposed to be two-way. They should be between teacher and student. The teacher expects the student to engage the class, to ask questions. Okay? All right. In Japan, the main mode of teaching is one way. It's from teacher to student. Okay? From teacher to student, just like in high school. Now, of course, this is a normative statement. Right? There are Zeni classes in the university, especially when students are juniors and seniors, and there's a lot of give and take. Also, in the US, there are large lecture classes, and the teaching is one way. Right now, this is a one-way lecture, right? I love your questions. Maybe there'll be time afterwards, but this particular class is one way. So I think that's a big difference. I'm not going to go into it in this lecture, but behind that difference in communication style is Koshi and Socrates. Okay? I just want to plant that seed. All right? Socrates, Plato, and Plato are really the fathers of education in the West. And their views of education shape many things even today, including the idea of two-way communication. On the other hand, Koshi is kind of the father of communication, the father of education and society in the East. And Koshi's ideas about knowledge and how knowledge is expressed and conveyed also have shaped university instruction and all education in especially East Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. All right. Let's go on to H, homework load. There are really some big differences even in homework load between the two countries. All right. For example, in the United States and Canada, when a student takes a class, this is a rule of thumb. A rule of thumb is just a word that means a guideline. It's not really a rule. But in general, students are expected to study about 2 hours outside of class for every 1 hour of class. Okay, so for every hour in the classroom, you will do a lot of homework, a lot of independent work. Now, in Japan, at Nihon Daigaku or Waseda or Keio or Ritsumeikan, it's almost the opposite. Students have a lot of classes, they have a lot of class hours, and most professors expect them maybe to do 1 hour of study for 2 hours of class. So it's kind of an inverse proportion. So far I've gone through some of the similarities and some of the differences. Have you followed these? Do you kind of agree with my analysis so far? All right. So what I would like to go into next is popular criticism of Japanese universities. Okay? This is not my criticism, but I'm just sharing with you some common criticisms. All right. A, leisure lands. Leisure lands. Now, this is a phrase by someone you probably don't know. You've heard his name. Nakasone Yasuhiro, former prime minister. And he was one of the first and a very prominent critic of Japanese higher education. And he used the word, he said, Japanese universities are nothing more than leisure lands. That students show up, they have fun, they don't learn very much. We need to change. So that was Nakasone's criticism. B, a second criticism of Japanese universities is that they are mainly, the phrase is old boy networks. Sorry girls, okay, I don't mean to exclude you. But the idiom is old boy networks. And what that means is that their main purpose is to make connections. Okay? To make connections in order to get a job. Now, why is there a picture of the Waseda baseball team up here? Well, if you get on the Waseda baseball team, you will get a job when you graduate. Right? It's true, actually. And that's because of the old boy network. Because the senpai are in many different companies and corporations and organizations, and they will look after their kohai, and they will interview, and they will hire them, and they will give them jobs. So the Waseda baseball team is a very important organization. Now, a similar thing is true at other universities like Hitotsubashi or Keio. They have their own networks. It's not a guaranteed job, but it helps a lot. And they don't care so much what you studied. And traditionally, they don't even ask what your GPA is. Doesn't matter. As long as you get to the top of the escalator and you have the diploma, it's okay. Things are changing a little bit now, but that's still true. Okay. All right. C. Another criticism comes from the leaders of major Japanese corporations and businesses. And there has been a common complaint for 1 or 2 decades that when companies hire university graduates, they have to completely retrain them. Okay? It's almost like they have to begin university again. Many companies and corporations spend 6 months or a year training their new employees. And leaders of corporations complain, the students just spent 4 years in university. Why can't they learn something that's useful to us when we hire them? Why do we have to spend so much money retraining them? Okay, again, this is not my opinion, all right? I'm just conveying to you some popular criticisms. Now, the last view is parents' view. Not every parent, okay? But many parents complain that universities in Japan are kind of useless but obligatory. Okay? What does that mean? Useless means they don't really see their daughters or their sons learning a lot. But shikata ga nai. They have to pay the tuition and they have to go because if they don't, their future is not very bright. Their chance of getting a good job or a permanent job is not very optimistic. Of course, it will probably influence who you marry or whether you marry, right? I mean, usually university graduates, especially at elite universities, they have a much different family future or marriage partner than someone who only graduates from high school. So even though it's very, very expensive for Japanese families, mashikata they have to put the money up. Now, by the way, I think next time you go home for break, if you find the right moment, you should thank your parents, all right? ICU is the most expensive university in Japan. Okay. Actually, it's not literally true. There are medical schools that are more expensive, but it's the most expensive kind of general, it's the most or almost the most expensive general university. So I think, like kokoro kara, at some point, you really should tell your parents how grateful you are. That's just my advice, okay? All right. Now, let's go on to the next part of the lecture. All right. Differences between the US and Japanese universities in the qualities demanded of students. Okay? I think this goes a little bit more in depth. Now, some of you probably have even applied to university in Canada or the United States or Britain, and you know that it's a much different process. Right? These universities look at, quote, the whole person. Okay, the whole person. Were you a good athlete? Were you a member of the debate club? Did you win any awards? What did you do during your summers? Not only what was your score on the entrance exam, right? Your grades are important. The recommendations from your students, from your teachers. So the qualities that are demanded of applicants to American universities and to Canadian universities are much different. In Japan, there's only one standard, generally, okay? And that is your score on the entrance exam. Okay? Now, I realize now that a small number of students are accepted by AO, admissions office criteria, and also, of course, there's Suisen. And Suisen is not easy either, but these are really a very small minority of students who are able to gain acceptance. So I think, in general, my statement is still true. And so A, personal qualities reviewed for admission is much different between the two cultures and societies. B, emphasis during university life. All right. So, what is the emphasis? Now, my thesis here is a little bit suspicious, okay? But I'm going to use it anyway. I'm going to make this claim. In the US and in Canada, I think the main quality demanded of university students is how to be disciplined. They need to learn how to focus, how to study, how to pass their courses. They need to learn how to use time well, how to analyze. Now, in Japan, at the typical university, what do students do? Again, I'm saying typical, I'm not saying ICU. All right? Well, we already saw that escalator, right? Escalator, we know that 90% of the students graduate on time within 4 years. So I don't think study is the main focus. Instead, clubs, copa, dating, friendship, exploration, those are the main activities that students engage in. What club you belong to is probably has a bigger impact on your university experience than what division you are in or what major you have. Now, this is beginning to change, but the importance of grades, GPA. In the US, GPA is quite important, all right? What grades you get in university make a difference in your employment possibilities. Okay. Traditionally in Japan, employers didn't even look at GPA. Okay? It didn't matter whether people got a C or a B or even a D, as long as you passed. That was all that mattered. Again, this is changing a little bit, but I think it's still generally true. So the question that I want to ask you is not, is one better than the other? Because I don't think that's true. I want to go deeper. The question I want you to think about, the questions are these. Why are there these differences? Why are there these differences between these two educational systems and these two societies and cultures? Right? They look the same. So many things about the university are the same. But yet, when we look under the surface in all of these ways, there are these very significant differences. Are Japanese universities really playgrounds and leisure lands? Was Nakasoni's criticism correct? Are they a waste of time? Well, maybe and maybe not. I think that to understand this question better, we can't really look at universities only, because that's a very small slice of time. That's just 4 years in people's entire lives. Now, it's a significant part of a society, or a country, or a national education system, but it's still a very limited time. I think we need to look at US versus Japanese high schools. Okay. Interesting. They are really different, okay? They are really different, all right? If we look at American high schools, okay, there's some study, all right? But not very much. The main focus is on independence, going out, romance, right? Homecoming and prom. Who are you going to prom with? Often it's on drinking, all right? And in some respects, you could say it's on character development, all right? I remember when I was a junior in high school, I made a bet with a friend of mine. And I bet him that I said, during my junior year in high school, I will never take a book home. Okay? And during that entire year, I never took a book home from school. Okay? I'm not proud of that, okay? But that was a bet. It's not really necessary to study very hard, and that's not the focus. Now, for more evidence, think of movies about American high school. Okay? Mean Girls. Did you ever see Mean Girls? It's a little bit old, okay? But also TV programs like One Tree Hill or Beverly Hills 90210. You never see them study. Did you ever watch Glee? What are they doing? They never even have a test practically. All right? They are like me my junior year. All right? So I think there's really a very interesting difference between high schools in America, in North America, and the US. And these are some scenes from American high school life. Do you recognize yourself? Do you see yourself? Okay. This is called visual evidence. Visual evidence. That's what LBH, the Little Brown Handbook, there's a short chapter on visual evidence. Okay. Now, in Japan, there is a small amount of play in high school. Okay? It's not only studied, but really, in contrast to North America, there's an incredible focus on discipline, directedness, school rules, uniformity, right? Even uniforms. Not every school has uniforms, but very common. Curfews, mongen, all right? what to read, how to act. The university, the high school curriculum is basically decided by MEXT, the Ministry of Education. And at least at public universities, almost every student in the country is studying the same thing the same day. So there's incredible control. Now, what do students do when the high school day is over? They go to Juku. They do more study. Unimaginable in North America. Okay? You go play football or you go hang out with your friends. I won't say the other things that you do, okay? But you do lots of things, all right? And if you watch the movies, you know that students are not studying. Of course, these are normative statements. There are some very focused students in America. There are some very good high schools. But I'm making very general or broad brush comparisons. So, this is my assertion that in the US and in North America, high school is a kind of time for experiment and experience, not for study. So those 3 or 4 years in high school, students are young, but they are forming their own identity. They're involved with a lot of clubs and activities. They're doing sports. They begin to have romantic relationships. They hang out a lot. They have a lot of free time. And my assertion is not, oh, they are just lazy. It's a waste of time. But they are learning some essential things in their society. Okay. And so here's my hypothesis, and that is that the qualities that are stressed in high school tend to be the most important in a society. For almost everyone goes to high school. Okay? So when we look at Japanese society, we really find a focus on knowing how to work in groups, knowing how to study, knowing how to follow directions. If you break the kisoku, it's a problem. The rules exist to be rules, not necessarily because they're smart, like you shouldn't wear earrings because it's bad for you. But basically, high school is a time when each society expresses its most fundamental values about this is what we want our citizens and our people to be like. Right? So there's a very different time for that. There's a very different emphasis. Okay. Now, this also has the interesting implication that both societies realize you can't really stop after high school. That even though in Japan, the emphasis is on discipline, study, focus, teamwork, group work, following rules, and in America, for example, the emphasis tends to be more on experimentation, experience, freedom, making mistakes, doing lots of stuff, some crazy things, including that. To develop further in both societies, people need to continue to experience other things. So, in a way, in America, when students go to university, they really need to develop focus and discipline. Of course, much of this is individual. There's a saying, swim or sink. You either swim or you sink. So the American university students, they need to learn how to study, learn how to focus, learn how to pass their classes, or they sink. They don't graduate. They drop out. Now, in Japan, the focus is much different, I would argue, and that is that the emphasis in university is on breadth, experience, freedom, dating, going beyond narrow conformity. So that even though Nakasone says Japanese universities are leisure lands, or business leaders criticize them, I think the kind of character development and identity formation and the experimentation that's going on is kind of the inverse, the contrast of high school. And it helps young Japanese develop in a different way. So my point is that both North American and Japanese universities try to build maturity. They try to help people grow, but they do it in very different ways. And they build different kinds of maturity because the students' high school experience is much different from each other. All right. So in other words, the form is the same, but the function is different. Right? The function. Yakuwari. Right? So the form is the same, but the function is different. And this is what gave me such trouble as a young university teacher. That I could see that the form was the same, but I couldn't understand the function because I couldn't see the difference between the two societies. All right. What about ICU? Okay, what about ICU? ICU is kind of a combination of both, I think. And I think this is how you can best understand the curriculum at the university, the clubs at the university, the structure of the university, and your experience at the university. And I'm hoping, actually, that my lecture today gives you a bit of a map that helps you understand your experience. I hope it's kind of meaningful to you. So I think ICU is still Japanese, but it's more like North American universities than other Japanese universities. Okay. Now, what are the reasons? Well, A, obviously there's more freedom for choosing major, right? Now at ICU, you can't change your major 23 times very easily, but you can change your major. You choose your major, you can change it, and you have much, much more freedom than at the typical Japanese university. B, more electives. Electives means more freedom to choose your classes, especially in stream 1 and 2. I think some of your stream 3 and stream 4, some of the stream 3 and stream 4 students envy you, right? Because they have less choice. And you do have to take gen ed, and you do have to take foundation courses, but generally speaking, you have a lot of freedom. At ICU, most of our classes meet 2 or 3 times a week. Okay, most don't meet 4 times. Of course, there's Gorochi and there's Rochi, but generally, as a rule, ICU is kind of halfway between North American universities and Japanese universities. Very few once-a-week classes, and most classes meet a couple of times a week. All right. D. Some classes are two-way. Some classes have two-way communication. For example, LLA doesn't have two-way communication, but your ARW and RCA classes should have some two-way communication. You should be able to ask questions and engage, talk with your other students. All right. E. Now, at ICU, you will have lots of homework, but not as much as in the US, believe it or not, okay? The homework load is easier. Now, in languages, of course, you need to study to improve language, right? If you don't study vocabulary, you won't know more words, and you won't be able to read as well. So some of you are studying vocabulary, you're reading, you're writing, you're doing things like that. But generally, not as much. F. Okay. ICU is not easy to graduate from, but it's not that hard. Okay? It's not that hard. You know, in the ELA, for example, if you come to class and you try hard, nobody fails, really. That's not true in the United States. If you're taking a chemistry class or an English class and you don't perform up to the level required to pass, doesn't matter, you fail. It doesn't matter if you came to every class. It doesn't matter. Well, it might matter a little bit if there's like participation grade, but generally that's not part of the criteria. But I think at ICU, generally, it's not so true, okay? So, G. At ICU, clubs, circles, groups are not stressed so much, but they are more popular than in North America. Okay? I think at ICU it's kind of a hybrid, right? You can change clubs. Right? When I was at Ritsumeikan, once students chose a club, that was it almost. For 4 years, they could belong to nothing else. I'm exaggerating, but kind of true. But in ICU, there's movement between clubs, there are circles, there are groups with various levels of involvement. If you don't want to be in the tennis club, you can be in the tennis circle. Or you can form your own group. There's a lot of freedom that way. Okay. All right. So what's my conclusion? What's my conclusion? Kind of kokoro-ka. This is my conclusion. It's not propaganda, okay? My conclusion is that ICU has a really good balance. If we look at characteristics common of North American universities and common to Japanese universities, there's a nice balance between studying hard, but also having some time and freedom for friendship, for clubs, and romance, right? For exploring your own identity and exploring yourself. Right? So there are great opportunities for study abroad, but there is also good study in Japan and at ICU. You can do volunteer activities, you can do service learning. There are so many opportunities for personal exploration and personal experience beyond the classroom. So that's really my concluding point. Now, I've covered a lot of ground in this lecture. I've talked a lot about a lot of different things, and I've made a thesis, and I've kind of followed it. I want to say, though, very strongly, like Mayland, don't accept my ideas. All right? Think for yourself. Question them. My own ideas are the result of my experience, but the reason I'm giving you this lecture today is to build your own thinking. I want you to take my ideas and refine them, or reject them, or go beyond them. They are not a sort of final point on this issue. All right. Thank you very much. Arigato.